department, and he has spent his lifetime studying how do you develop really good surveys. Mostly he does voting, like looking at voting, big national polls on voting. He's done a lot with climate change right now. How do people think about climate change? And so we've just worked with him over the years, and so a lot of these tips are coming from him. And I just wanted to point that out because I'm happy to share his website later on. He has a wealth of information in it. A lot of it's research articles about survey development, so it's a nitty-gritty. And at the same time, he does have more pieces that are just straightforward without all that.
Can you just mention his name?
Yeah, John Krosnick. I actually have his name on one of the slides, but it's Jon, and the last name is Krosnick. And I've learned a lot from him over the years about development experience. Okay, so the next one is easy to analyze. So you can, I know this one well, you can collect all the data in the world, but if it's not easy to analyze and you don't have the people or time to do it, it's a bummer, right? You're not going to learn anything from what you've done. So you really want to make sure from the from the very beginning, are we going to be able to analyze this? Are we going to be able to set it up in a way that makes it easy to analyze? And then another one is making it short. Most research shows 10 to 15 minutes max on what you want. And I often think that's how we try to design a lot of our surveys that we do. And this is mostly surveys that we're doing when we're doing research. And I think, well, yeah, someone could do this in 10 minutes. And then I look at the time it's taking people because I can see from online. And it could be 20 minutes, or someone starts it and then stops it, right? So you really want to make sure that you're able to go through that. And a key piece of that is knowing that sometimes 10 or 15 minutes is to pilot it. Probably the most important thing is to test your survey with your colleagues, or just get a few people and say, hey, can you just take this? How long did it take you? What questions were confusing? Was there a period missing here? Was this 5 verbs in a row and then a noun? Right? All these small things that when you're designing a survey, the more you can make it really readable and easy to read, will make it much easier for the participant, and they'll be able to actually answer it most accurately. And again, a lot of John's work that I really like is his work is focusing on how do we get the most valid and reliable answers. And this sort of survey design helps us to do that. And I just wanted to pause here and say if anyone has any questions as I go through, please go ahead, ask. Okay, so different types of surveys. So a lot of us will use open-ended, right? So we all know what open-ended are. Here's an example. What are the 2 most important things you learned in blueprints here? And people will just write whatever they want. And then we have our here's another example too. And all of these examples I've taken from So open-ended are great for when you have situations where you don't know all the response options. Okay, so if you don't know all the answers, you don't know what people are going to write for this, that's when you should use an open-ended question. When you don't know every single possible response answer, use an open-ended. If you do know all the possible response answers, or you want to rank or rate people, then you're going to want to do, there was one, sorry. I'm going to step back. There was one more thing I wanted to add about open-ended. And this goes back to the earlier point of when you get open-ended questions are great because you get real details of what people are thinking and talking about. I love interviews. I do a lot of them. But then you often get a wealth of responses, right? So here is an example, I'm sorry it's so small, but all of these different lines or sentences, and this was 3 pages, so this was from one of the evaluation reports. 3 pages of just everyone's response to this question. So then you think, what am I going to do with this? I have a huge list of answers. How am I going to really make sense of it? So one of the things that we do a lot, and if you have the time and capacity to set up, is a great thing to do, is to just try to make a really easy, what we call like a coding system. So here's some examples of the same responses, and then you just make an Excel document. You're just saying, okay, how many teachers talked about they want more hands-on activities? How many teachers talked about the physical space for area? Right? So if you're able to do that, then at the very end, you can go through and say, hey, we have 30 teachers who wanted more hands-on. We had 2 teachers who talked about additional opportunities. We had this and that. So that helps you in a really quick way. So you can go back to other colleagues, you can go to your funders and say, hey, we took all of this, open-ended information, and this is kind of the bulk of what they still want. And then if you really want to have someone else go into the nitty-gritty, then you can do that. Again, this, when you first do it, it takes, this took me about 5 minutes to set up. I just copy and pasted all the answers, put in Excel, and then I just kind of go through and say, okay, what's kind of the key things that are coming up? Each time I see a key thing, I just add a new column, right? And then you can have a really good snapshot of what's happening. So if you have the time and resources to make sense of your open-ended, they're wonderful pieces of information. But you've got to make that time to really be able to figure out what's really happening with that great data. Okay, so the other thing are close-ended, right? So this is when you're ranking people or rating people, right? How satisfied are you in doing the activities within this learning program? Okay, so now we're going to kind of dive into a section of 5 or 6 overarching pieces of what makes really great questions and surveys. And what I've done here is for each one of these I've highlighted it in red, and then when I add in each new one, you'll see they'll come up in red, and then for each one, give you a few examples. So the first one is you really want your question and response choices to match, right? So you want to make sure, lots of us like to use agree, disagree on a Likert scale system, but that doesn't always really match what you're trying to really get at with that question, right? So this is, again, a really hard piece. Am I really getting at, from my response options, am I really getting at what I'm trying to figure out? Maybe I really want to know how confident they are at something instead of agreeing or disagreeing with that. Okay, so this takes a little bit of time of just doing it a lot to get through. But there's a few tips that can be helpful in this. And one is what we like to say is find the hidden variable in the actual question and the right response choices for that hidden variable. So an example, how useful was the opportunity to visit other school gardens? So what you're really trying to figure out was how useful it was, right? So then you're making your scale of not useful, somewhat useful, useful, very useful. So you're using that word useful. Before we had the word satisfied, right? Someone would write very not satisfied at all, a little satisfied, moderately satisfied, very satisfied, right? So you're really trying to figure out what is that word, that noun, that object that you're really trying to dive into. Okay, so avoid asking these types of questions. Agree, disagree. I've used a lot of agree, disagree in my work over the times, and again, you'll have some people who will say, yeah, some researchers in survey development will say, yeah, it's a really important tool. Working with John a lot, he's really against using them, and the main reason is because people are more likely, research shows people are more likely to agree, right? It's called acquiescence bias. So people are more likely to say, yes, that's true. Yes, I totally do that. I strongly agree. So if you want a reliable and valid answer, you want to create your survey so you're going against that acquiescence bias. You don't want people to necessarily always agree. You really want to get at what's going on there. So here's an example. The NGSS in the garden program improved my students' enthusiasm for learning. Strongly agree, disagree, strongly agree. So I want you to take a moment and think about what we were just talking about with that hidden variable and how you might be able to, how might you be able to change this? What response options would you make instead? So take 30 seconds, turn to your neighbor, think about what response options you might do instead.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to hear some of people's, so I want to share what you were discussing, what's sort of responsible. Yeah.
He would potentially say that the NGSS, after the NGSS garden program, my students were, and then you would say less enthusiastic, somewhat enthusiastic, weird, more enthusiastic.
Okay, yeah, great. So you can look at an enthusiastic level. Anyone else? Yeah.
She mentioned using the verb improved and say there was improvement, moderate improvement, no improvement.
Yeah, exactly. So again, this is a situation, what do you really want to know? So that's what you have to think about for every question, right? Like you spend a lot of time and resources teaching your programs, and you want to put in time and resources to really making sure you're evaluating well and really knowing what do we really want to know, right? What's really going to help us improve? So maybe this question that you really want to look at is improvement on that. And that was one thing that I was thinking too, right? So you can change these response options to say, did not improve, improved a little, improved a moderate amount, improved a great deal, improved a lot. Okay, so that way you get away from that agree, disagree scaling. Yeah.
Can I ask, we spoke about the fact that, yeah, you definitely don't want to do, did not improve or improve and leave it at that, but what degree of a scale is helpful? I mean, improved a little bit,
Yeah.
improved a great, improved a lot, improved a little. I mean, it's like, I know when I'm doing a survey myself, I'm like, none of those fit exactly what I want to say. I know when it's thinking about the lesson choice. I mean, you don't want just two choices, but
Yeah, so that is a question that is it's kind of a big target question, and we are going to go over that. I have examples of the different types of scales that we're going to want to use, and we're going to be talking about different types of constructs, whether you have a unipolar or a bipolar construct, and this is the sorts of thing that John spends years and years doing. Okay, this doesn't quite fit everyone, but what is the most reliable? What is the most valid scale? They're never going to be perfect. I mean, I'm more of a qualitative researcher at my heart because I love deep, rich data, and I've spent a lot of time teaching, so I like to get in there and really understand. Although it's hard to pull out from that what's the big picture. That's what surveys and big scales like Likert scales that you have lots of numbers can give you. And at the same time, I know it's never going to be ideal, but there are ways to make it better. So we're going to go over that in just a few minutes. That sorts of scales.
Do you mind going to just maybe just the difference between reliability and validity?
Yeah. So you have these two different reliable and what's valid. So reliable is it's going every single time that people are doing it, you're going to get answers. It's consistently people are going to be consistently answering as much as possible in the same way, right? So that's what makes it reliable. Valid is more, is your question really getting at what you're trying to answer? Okay, so those are two things that are happening with any scale. There's different when you design a survey, you ideally have a survey, you test it a lot with lots of different people, and then you get reliability measures. So you run all the statistical analysis, you get little statistical Cronbach's alpha and say, okay, this tells me that this, for the most part, is a reliable scale, that pretty much people are, if they're taking it again and again, are going to be giving the same sorts of answers. Yeah. Okay, so here's another example. So how would you, why don't you take another minute or two, look at this example. Although, I just want to point out what's different about this example from this example. This was just one question, right? Now you have a list of statements, right, in like a matrix form. And we do a lot of these in our surveys, right? So now all of a sudden you're like, how do I change it around now? Change around this question when I have maybe 8 or 9 statements here on the left that I'm trying to measure. So take a moment, think about it.
Are we still trying to do a matrix, like we're trying to come up
Yes.
with consistent?
You're still trying to do, now you're still trying to keep it in the matrix format. So how would you change this? Okay, does anyone have any details here? So this time, you're not going to necessarily be able to pull out, yeah. This time you won't necessarily be able to pull out variable. So change your scale. Okay? To what extent did the garden experience do the following? You start with a verb, make it super easy to read, statements, not at all, a little, moderately, a great deal, a lot. Okay, so that's, even if you look at the statements on the left, help me create meaningful activities. So over here you have this full sentence, and at the beginning of each sentence you're saying the same thing. The garden helped me, the garden experience, the time I spent in the garden helped me. So you want to get rid of all those extra words. You know, you want it, this is a time to shorten, make it short questions, because otherwise it's just going to add to the task difficulty for people to respond. You want to make it as easy and short for people to do, right? So instead of having these full sentences, just put it in your question, right? So I just put that garden experience in the question instead. To what extent did that? And then you get all of that beginning phrasing that you had in each sentence out of there. And then you can just start super easy with a direct verb on the left-hand side to make it short. And then changing the scale to that, because that's really what you're trying to get at. You're not really trying to look at do they disagree or agree with this. You're really trying to look at the extent that they're doing this, right? So that's what it's getting at. It's like, what are you really trying to get? And for most of us, that's what we're trying to do. To what extent are my students now doing this? To what extent are my teachers now doing this? Okay. So with that, I have to say, the other sorts of questions that are not ideal, although I don't have caveat for this, are yes and no, and true and false questions. Okay. Yes and no, I looked at, a lot of people had yes and no on their surveys. For your context, in general, for a lot of those, they were fine. Like, do you plan to do this program again next year? Yes or no. At the same time, the reason why, John Krosnick in his work, same thing for agree, disagree, yes, no, true, false. Why we try to avoid those is because of the acquiescence bias. People are always like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. Sure, I will commit to that. Sure, I'm going to change my behavior, right? And no one really ever does, right? So this is trying to get away with this. So sometimes it can make it more wordy, and so you have to, these are suggestions. These are really good suggestions of how to make better surveys. But in each case, you're going to have to think about your own survey, the people who are taking it, and how much time you have. And you're going to have to balance those things out. So for example, instead of using yes, no, true, and false, include balanced responses. So, did you eat your vegetables today, or did you not eat your vegetables today? Because if you say yes or no, the kids go, well, sure, yeah, I ate them, right? But instead, you're not making it so much of that, oh yeah, I have to agree with what this person is telling me, right? The norm isn't as strong, right? That's what we're trying to do a lot in surveys, is there's so much norm bias, like we want to make everyone feel good, right? We want to make the person who's giving us a survey feel good, we want to agree with them. So if you just ask it as balanced questions, did you eat them, did you not eat them, right? Or did being in the garden this week make you want to eat vegetables this week? Or this weekend after? Or did it make you want to avoid eating vegetables? Right? So you can ask it that way. Yeah.
One of our big questions is, do you plan on starting a garden? What would be a better way to ask that?
Plan on starting a garden. I would probably say, would you plan, in a certain time frame, right? So you might want to know, I usually like to have things within a certain time frame. So within the next 3 months, or 6 months, whatever, the school year, are you planning to start a garden, or are you not planning to start a garden?
Wouldn't that be a yes or no?
So that, and they would just circle it, right? Yes, or so your two response options, sorry, that might not be here. Your two response options would be am planning to start a garden, am not planning to start a garden. So in the next 6 months, colon, I am planning to do the following. That's what I would say. The next 3 months, I am planning to do the following. Start a garden, not start a garden.
So
Right.
even though there's like a not in there, which is kind of
Yeah.
implies negative, it's still not as much as I
Yeah, and again, it's not, that's true. There is that bias going on as well. Again, none of it is perfect, right? So you will have to decide, you will have to decide on your survey. You might not have a lot of room on surveys. I mean, the thing I hate the most is making my beautiful 4-page survey into 2 pages because I can't take 4 pages, right? There's not enough time, it's too much cognitive overload. And so in that sort of instance, if I just wanted to have a 1-page survey and I didn't have a lot of space, then yeah, that sort of question, maybe I would just say, okay, I'm just gonna add yes or no, right there. Okay, so you have to kind of make that decision as you're going along. And with that sort of question, what ideal would be, if not, can you explain? Right, so after that, say, hey, we want to know why you're not. So that makes people feel, that negates the negative, right? So if someone's like, no, I'm not planning to do it. You don't want them to feel bad that they can't start a school garden, but if you say to them, no, why not? And they're like, oh my goodness, we have so much going on, and the district's not supporting us, and there's too many superintendents to just, like one of the districts I worked with that used to come and take the food from the after-school kids programs and take their food. So, all those sorts of realities that happen. Yeah, well, to take this one.
And I guess you could phrase it to like, I'm planning to start a school garden in the next 6 months, in the next year, in the next 5 years, or, I mean, it could sort of emphasize a time frame instead of a yes, no, and you can infer that, oh yeah, they're gonna start this year.
Yeah, that's a great thing. Again, what are you trying to get at? And that's a great one. It gives a really specific, allows that time of like, are you planning to do this or not at all? And if not at all, why? Right?
In some of the surveys we do, I've noticed that if it's if no, please explain, but there's no if yes, please explain, you're gonna get the acquiescence bias as well, because they're gonna be like, oh, so really, they want me to explain why I don't wanna do this, so let me just say it too.
Yeah.
It's also the shortcut, like our teachers don't have time and they're already overloaded, and they're just clicking through half reading. If there's a you have to explain it if you said this, I'm definitely not choosing that answer, I'm not choosing it.
Yeah.
So it starts to skew your results, and so when we run post analytics on our environmental center field trip, and just about anything that we do with PD and things like that too, and it's anytime you have to explain, if you don't explain on both sides.
And that is
an answer.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because that is something we do as well. We'll say if yes, why, if no, why, right, on a question that we have like that. So that you're really getting in that deeper piece of what's really happening for people as well.
Can you just say, please explain your response, or should it be more specific? Because I usually, have a question and say, if it's kind of a yes or no, please explain your response.
Yeah,
Is it
please
better to
explain
be
your
more
response.
explicit?
Please explain your response, Sometimes if it's not more direct, like, right underneath if yes or if no, then you're like, I don't want to explain it.
Yeah.
Right? And so again, this is why piloting and testing your survey is so important, right? So have, I'm sure you all have the kind of 10 teachers or even colleagues in your organization who work in a different department and, you're giving this and really figuring out, you can ask them, what was the sort of question you wanted to avoid answer? Tell me why, right? One of the things that John does for every single survey question is he will get a group of people and do a think aloud. He'll say, I want you to tell me that question without using the words that are in that question. Right? What are you thinking that question's asking you? And don't tell me using any of the words in that question. Right? So that really gets you thinking, what are people really thinking about when they're reading this question? Right? So if you're that takes a lot of time, but even if you're able to sit down with one or two colleagues, I would suggest someone who's not in the education piece, right? Someone who's outside of that, potentially, right? And because they're going to give you a different eye to that. And then maybe have a teacher or two, right? And it's, the world and all of our complex brains. Okay. So, again with this, this one, begin the scale with a more negative response choice. So the other thing research shows that there's what's called a primacy effect. So if you have a scale from left to right, your Likert scale, that people are more likely to just choose the first answer, right? They'll just first answer. That's called the primacy effect. So if you want to get away from this, both people, always answering, positive, 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 because I put all my positive answers first on the left-hand side. It's, in general, it's not always cases, but in general, it's better to start with the more not at all, right? Go from not at all to all the time, as opposed to going from all the time to not at all. Interestingly, it's the opposite when you do oral surveys. So if you're doing, you're calling, these people for like a lot of the work, calling up and saying, hey, I'm going to give you a phone survey, right? In that case, people are more likely to choose the answer that was most recently given to them, right? So you have different effects of whether it's a written survey, Likert, or an oral one, and it can be the exact same question, and you'll get statistically different depending on whether it's written or oral. Okay, so use verbal labels and do not combine verbal and numeric labels. So, for example, how useful, this is getting back to our academic useful, how useful was the partnership? So it's, this one's starting with the more negative, which you like, not useful, going to a very useful, but it's combining both numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, with text, the variable labels. It is cognitively challenging for people to do this, right? So every single question, someone has to first the thing they have to do is read the question, then they have to think, what are they asking me? Then they have to look at the response options, then they have to figure out what they're really thinking in that moment. So that's 5 things that they're trying to do in 30 seconds to go on to the next question. So if you have both numbers and text, it makes it really challenging to do that. It's just adding to the cognitive task, and you want to reduce that cognitive task. So instead, just have your scale be not at all useful, lightly useful, moderately useful, very useful, extremely useful, and just get away from the numbers.
Excuse me. Yeah, what about just taking the numbers off and having the 2 poles and leaving it to the people to decide where they sit on that grading?
Yeah, so there are things like having the continuum. In general, the research shows for a few reasons, it's better to give these options. It's easier for analysis, right? Because then, we're doing this all the time. Not at all gets I'm turning this into an Excel form that I can run statistics on. Not at all is going to be a 1. Slightly useful is going to be a 2, right? So that I can easily get everyone's answers. But also, you're making the task easier for someone. It's not ideal, and your moderate is probably going to be a little different than my moderate. But overall, when you look at the big pictures, this is a little better way to do it statistically is to give people those boxes so you're helping them with that task. Okay, so this gets back to the question we have about different types of contracts and whether, how much do I do? Is it 1 to 100, a 1 to 10, a 1 to 7, a 1 to 3, a 1 to 5? Okay, so there's different types of constructs. The first are bipolar constructs. So bipolar constructs, so a construct first is just, the variable that's measuring a certain characteristic or trait, right? So a construct, when there's an actual true neutral point or a true, point of ambivalency somewhere in the middle, that's considered a bipolar construct. Just real quick checking. Okay, and then try. Okay. So for example, is the garden program too long, too short, or just right? Is your forage too long, too short, just right? So there's a middle place, right? There is a middle neutral place. It's just right. That's a neutral point. Okay. As opposed to unipolar constructs, where there's a specific amount from maximum to minimum. So for example, how willing are you to teach garden programs back in your classroom after participating in this PD program? Right? There's really no middle point. What you're really trying to look at is how willing, from not at all willing to extremely willing. So these are different types of constructs, bipolar, unipolar constructs. You can always Google these too if you're like, wait, what does that mean again? I'm trying to create my survey. SurveyMonkey, even if you go to SurveyMonkey Help or just Google this, you'll get a bunch of really easy examples that a lot of the online survey software companies are now doing. And you can be like, oh yeah, that's what my construct is. And the reason why it's kind of important to know what type of variable or this trait or characteristic you're trying to measure is because there is statistically significant reasons why you should choose a 5-point scale versus a 7-point scale. So if you're using a unipolar scale, they're usually best as 5 points. So 5 points meaning point 1 is extremely, very, moderately, slightly. Each one of those have 5 different response options. Okay, so if you have a unipolar scale, and for a lot of you, this is a lot of what you're using in your answer choices. And so what's great about this is you're like, hey, now it makes it really easy. I can just take my questions and fit it into this, right? Or then you can also, if you just have that one question where you really want to get at the certain variable, improvement or satisfaction, then you can just add that word in. Extremely satisfied, very satisfied, moderately satisfied, right? Or whatever it might be. I do have to say that the fourth one, a great deal to none at all. Some people say, wait, a great deal is a lot. Is that the same as a lot, right? I mean, yeah, it's not an ideal science, right? But for the most part, these scales work really well. Here I have listed them from the most positive to the most negative. Again, on your scale, you want to reverse that. And there's John's name. I just put 2019 because this is from one of his latest presentations he did, but he's been doing this work forever and he can probably.
Is there any reason behind the difference between a 5-point scale and a 4-point scale? One of my colleagues likes the 4-point scale because it forces, in a lot of our questions, someone to choose whether it's more towards the positive or the negative and doesn't allow them to choose a neutral rating. Do you have any opinion on?
In general, these are a little bit more valid in the 5-point. And I could actually probably get back to you on that as well, looking at some of the 4-point scales. Yeah, I mean, I get that, and I do know that sometimes people will say, okay, we want to kind of choose them into a situation. One of the reasons is the bigger scale you have, and again, this is, especially when you're doing research or if you have the evaluator you're looking at who's running statistics and is running significance and things like that. The more answer choice options you have, it's going to be much easier to run the statistics on, right? So if you have a 5 and a 7 scale, that's much easier, to look at it's much easier to run the statistics on and really interpret any sort of significance than having a 3-point or a 4-point scale. Again, some of you might not be doing that, but in general, this sort of thing I think is helpful. It does allow someone who might be in that spot to do that.
Why?
Huh?
Why?
Why would
You said, it's more statistically accurate to have more,
just because you have greater data. Yeah, you have more data points, right? More data points that you're working with there. That you can like when you're looking at like the standard deviation between each one, you have just more data points, gives you more power.
Just in response to the 4-point, like as a survey taker, I despise when I don't have like the neutral option because some things I'm just neutral on. So like as a survey taker, I've had surveys where there was just, the 4 and that it feels forced. It feels like I'm forced to make a decision whether I'm like on one side or the other. Just some things I'm just neutral on. So
I agree with you. I mean, that's been our debate back and forth.
yeah.
I mean, it's great we're having those conversations, right? I mean, most people don't even get to those conversations. So it's great to be having those. And those are the sorts of things of, same thing. I mean, I am the worst person. I mean, I will take everyone's survey now because I made so many people take surveys. I feel it's part of my karma back that I have to take everyone's survey. But I feel like I got a survey from the Subaru dealership. It was 3 pages. It must have been 45 minutes, and I just wrote the top way too long. I'm not taking this. Back to your research department, right? So, so I think that you want to know what people. I mean, there's times all the time that I'm like, yeah, why don't they have this response option? So you do. That's part of that pilot test. Yeah, there was a question over here. Okay. Is there any more? Yeah.
And the fact is that some people are just neutral. You can't really make them one way or the other. That's just the way it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Some people are in that.
Yeah. They're
Or in that kind of, well, maybe, slightly, moderately, kind of, about half the time, right? Especially for like the one on that bottom scale, it is good to know kind of. Okay, so bipolar scales. So remember, this is a situation where you definitely have a strong neutral point. That last one we looked at was a continuum from a minimum amount to a maximum amount. Here, they're looking more like, it's more like a balance, more like a scale on 2 sides, right? You have kind of the positive over here, you have kind of the negative over here, a neutral thing as opposed to more of a continuum. It is, I realize that the constructs can be a little hard to get your head around, and so I suggest going back, every now and again, just Google them, go to SurveyMonkey, go to other programs, and you'll get some good examples there.
On a single survey, let's say you have 5 questions, is it wise to use the same construct for each question? Or can you use multiple constructs on a single survey?
So the construct would be like the main trait or characteristic you're getting at. So usually you'll want to measure several different ones, right? And so you have to make your decision. Am I going to have a survey that's really focused questions? So I'm asking 5 focused questions. Each question is just getting at one construct, right? Or am I going to put, I want to ask a bunch of different questions and have some open-ended at the end, so I'm going to make more of a matrix. And so I'm not going to be able to get, at each, then I'll create that matrix situation where I'm going from list of a bunch of things I want to measure, constructs, and then not at all to grade. Yeah.
So I understand why the 7-point scale would be better for data, but I think I saw that on the survey. It would make me kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Maybe, in terms of making it difficult for takers. So where's the balance in this?
Yeah, again, it's just what's been shown. I mean, it's so funny. Like, there's things that John has so many, a wealth of examples. He's been doing this work for 50 years, 40 years. And he'll say things like, this is what we all think, but what we really know from research is that this is the case. right? And this is one of those things where you're like, oh my God, yeah, people don't really like it, but they'll, if it's not, if you haven't made your survey too long, it will work. Again, I don't suggest having 2 pages of 7-point scales, right? And I would, for most of the surveys, you know, when I looked at them last night, most were unipolar constructs that you're measuring. And so most of them could be redone in that sort of situation, right? But yeah, it is exhausting and you want to be thinking about your participants. So maybe make the survey shorter. And again, that gets at what are the really key constructs? I don't want to be asking too many things, right?
Does any of this change according to your audience? I mean, are teachers more likely to respond differently to some of these than maybe parents or volunteers?
Well, that's a good question because a lot of this research, I think, has been predominantly done on adults. And so I know a lot of you who are working with kids. And so I was thinking about that last night, and I have an example coming up about that. I would say, you know, go with, it's not going to differ between like a teacher and administrator. The way you want to show your scales might differ with students, right? And a lot of you do that with pictures, which I think is great, right? Having that sort of picture communication for a young child is a really good way. But in terms of adults, no, it's all the same. It doesn't matter who it is. Okay, so here's an example. This is kind of taking everything we've discussed a little bit, and we want to reduce the task difficulty. Okay? Reduce the task difficulty of this question, which is down at the. It was a huge matrix, and I can only fit in the first statement. So up above, it's telling you about what all the answer choices are in the impact statement. So maybe just take a moment with your neighbor and think about how you might want to, how you might want to change them.
There's 2 options. Which is selection. The 2 is pretty. Yeah, like many times the 5 or every time. It's like using it every do for the people. Yeah. Every time I get this question, I go back to what it meant. And that would be like reading the question and was going ahead.
Okay, what are some of people's ideas? There's multiple options. That's like there's no one perfect response. Yeah.
Yeah,
You can give your impression first.
I was trying to see if, I couldn't quite come up with how to construct it, but I was thinking more along the lines of time focus. Students are able to focus for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30, etc. But I just couldn't come up with how to.
Yeah, so that's a great way to think about it, and that's one of the ways I was thinking about it too, is choosing your specific time intervals, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's hold that thought, because I want to hear from other people before I say anything, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say a similar thing, replacing just taking out the words they have right now and just instead putting in their definitions. So saying every class, almost every class, about once a week, once every few weeks, or never. And then you just take out a bit of redundancy.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was thinking. So if you look at this, for each one of these, you're giving 3 possible answers they have to think about for 5 different response options. That's too hard in our brain with current climate of what's going on, right? It's just too much cognitive overload with everything. So you can choose. Oh, we really want to know just class time, right? So all these is you just go from never do it to once every 2 weeks in class, once a week in class, three times a week in class, or every class, right? And those would be your response options. If you want to know specifically in relation to into the class, right? If you want to know in terms of times per class, then you can switch your response options. Or if you want to know all possibilities, you could. If you want to know all possibilities, then I would probably make this an open-ended question, right? So I would probably say, because you don't know all the response options in this, you could just say, this is hard because there's a matrix and stuff, but students are able to maintain focus, complete, or how often, right? You could just ask them as an open-ended question. The problem I have with asking an open-ended question, this sort of thing, is because then you have to do more analysis work on your end, right? Because then all of a sudden you're like, okay, now I have to translate that and put it into an Excel thing, and if I run the numbers, make it easy, right? So a lot of people even say, we have this debate all the time in our lab, how do you ask someone's age, right? For kids, they love saying their age. For adults are like, I don't really want to tell you how old I am. So what typically we do is we ask the years. But that adds another step to our analysis, right? Because then we have to then put people into the age category based on what their year is, right? So open-ended questions can give you all the possible responses that you might want, but then you have to be thinking about how am I going to analyze this, and am I going to do it? If I'm not, then
Are there really people that won't give their age but would give you the year of their birth?
It is. It's amazing. People get that filled out every single one, and not necessarily the year, right? Because it's easy. People are like, who's going to actually do the math if I put 1947, right? So people put the year, right? For things like income, we do categories, right? No one wants to ever put their exact income. So putting, most people have that income brackets, right? Same thing with education level. You can do, high school, associates, or you can lump things together. And then also the question around, how you want for people to identify themselves, right? So now we will often ask, how do you identify? So we will let people choose that for themselves, right? Or, on other times, female, male, people can have other, I don't even know, I'm trying to think of there wasn't a survey I've gone, but they did something where they gave forced choice response options recently. But I think in general, it's better for that sort of question to have the person respond and then just know, okay, that's a question that we're gonna take extra moment.
I was just thinking when you were going through this, that if you're evaluating like 50 teachers and that represents 1,500 kids, maybe, then if you're trying to analyze data from 1,500 people, you want to use more statistical methods, whereas for 50, it's not. You might have to think about whether you want to do a statistical or a response more open-ended, because you maybe don't have the numbers to do a good statistical analysis, so it might depend on what your application is, how much of this kind of scale you want to do and how many open-ended.
Yeah, that's a really good point. 50 you could probably still run the statistics on it. Yeah, I mean 90 would be ideal, but some people say 30 is again, it's in the statistical debate world. But yes, if you had 20 people, then I'm like, great, I'm going to ask a bunch of open-ended questions and know that I'm going to be doing that coding that I did earlier, right? Like once you start doing that, and you have the same survey you're using again and again with this, every year you're running a professional development program, 20 teachers, right? So if you made a template in Excel of like, okay, these are the general categories that I've been seeing for 3 years, then every year you just put in people's statements and you have an intern or someone, to go through and do that simple coding for you, then it makes it great, right? It makes it great to have lots of open-ended responses. I think, like I said, I was very much a qualitative ethnographer in my PhD program and then immediately went to Stanford and became a behaviorist by the lab I was put into. And so it's been a real interesting shift for me over the years to really think, okay, what are the benefits of big sets of data, right? Knowing that you're missing a lot of the social cultural context, which is like the heart of the sort of things I do. So it's, again, this balance. And if you are able to have the time to think about your qualitative data, then I always think that gives you so much more information, the richness of it. But if you want to have, if you have big numbers and you want to show hundreds of things, then it is important at times to even do simple coding on open-ended responses. The last one, I love the pictures. I think using pictures with kids is great. I love smiling faces. So why don't you just take a moment and again, thinking about reducing the task difficulty on this one, if you think there is. So go ahead and take a moment to think about.
I was for the past 2 years since I got hired on not get as much, but I just recently talked to them about restructuring it because I really want to be in the classroom and the teachers have to come out of it. So before I was doing it, basically I was teaching, and so now they're asking me to co-teach, basically teach me while
Okay, let's come back together and hear some of your thoughts on this. Or do you want to share first? Be honest, this is just a little tidbit. Our researcher at George Mason University, who we partner with, developed this, and she said that when she looked over our past surveys, students refused to circle a frowny face because they felt so bad for circling a frowny face. So that's why you have the creepy one in the middle. So let us know.
Yeah, we debated that face too. Maybe sport.
Yeah. And that's true, right? With all of this, that gets exactly what we're talking about. Norms are strong, right? Especially with kids and adolescents, right? We want to please. We want to do what we think we should. We want to be positive in what everyone in society tells us to do, right? So that's something you're thinking about. Anyone have any thoughts on this? Yeah.
I'm wondering if you would stay away from light and you move to willing to try it and do how much are you willing to try? Either like hand over the mouth, then small portions, and maybe a thumbs up smiley face at the end and I'll eat it all.
Yeah.
But I don't think you're asking quite the right question for that age of participation.
Okay. So yeah, that's a great suggestion of like changing what are you really trying to get at to get away, because life is such a powerful word for us, right? Especially with kids. Yeah.
It's asking 2 different questions.
Yeah.
So the I've never had this, you could have never had it, and also really like it. And
Yeah. So that's the first thing I noticed is that this response option, they're responding to 2 different questions. This one is a yes or no. I've had a yes or no, right? And we'll talk about that in a sec. This one is talking about how much you like it. So you're combining 2 different